Hello and welcome to your lecture on cities, kings, and Sargon. Grab your student notes and use them to follow along and fill in any blanks that you missed in class. In Mesopotamia, the agricultural revolution has occurred. People have stopped hunting-gathering and picked up farming instead. The first city, Eridu, is built originally as a chapel by the shores of the sacred lake Apsu, but as people move to be closer to that religious center, the temple grows bigger, more and more people are living there, and before you know it, it's a bustling city. And Eridu is not the only city. Cities have sprung up across Mesopotamia, places that started off as small temples or chapels and are now home to populations of up to 50,000 people. Now, a small group of nomads or a slightly larger group of farmers might be able to rule themselves without anyone telling them what to do. But a city? You have to keep order somehow. And so you start seeing the first government spring up in Mesopotamia about 3000 BC. These governments arose in order to keep order in the cities. As I said, Uruk had about 50,000 people at this time. You needed something to keep order. It's important to remember that all of Mesopotamia, or even all of Sumer, is not one country, one block ruled by one government at this point in time. Instead, each city is like its own country. Each city has its own government, its own rulers, and its own religions. I mention religion because at this point in time, priests held the most power. And that makes sense, right? After all, these cities grew up around chapels, around temples. The priests hold the most power. Daily life was centered around religion, the daily rituals, the holy days, the sacrifices. These were very important, not just to priests, but to everyday people. And so they looked to the priests for guidance. It's not surprising then that they also looked to the priests to rule them. The temples were powerful in another way as well. They were economic as well as religious centers. Most people worked for the temples and the priests in some way. And how did they get paid? In beer. When I told you that the Sumerians invented beer, you probably weren't expecting to hear that they used it as a way to pay their workers, but they did. This is the Mesopotamian beer ration tablet from about 3000 BC, and on it, it says how much barley beer each worker for the temple gets every day. So, temple, that's for whom you work, that's where you worship, and that is who gives you the beer for your day's wages. As cities grew bigger and bigger, and richer, they became tempting targets for outside attack. After all, if you could defeat a city and take all of its resources, think about how rich you would be, how much stuff you would have, how much beer you could drink. So cities realized that they needed a way to defend themselves from outside attack. Their solution was to build walls to keep invaders out and to raise armies to defeat anyone who managed to get through the walls. At first, ordinary citizens were in charge of building the walls and defending their city. Whenever the city needed defending, ordinary citizens, your farmers and your potters, would be called up to fight against the attackers or to build walls to keep them out. However, as people's fighting techniques and weapons technology improved, it soon became apparent that ordinary citizens who spent most of their time doing things other than fighting simply were not going to cut it as defense. So the army was invented. An army, of course, being a group of people who were trained to fight. Their whole job was war. Close quarters combat was the rule in ancient Mesopotamian battles. Soldiers used spears, axes, and maces to defeat their foes, while chariots, awkward two-wheeled things pulled by donkeys, served as mobile armories carrying weapons to be used in the assault. In the early centuries of city government, priests and temples were the law of the land. But around the year 2900 BC, they began to have to share their power with someone else, because this is when we have the rise of kings. At first, wars were thought to be wars between the gods of each city. The city with the strongest gods won. In this case, you see the god Ningirsu, who has caught the enemy army of Uma in his hunting net, and he's cracking their heads open with a mace while above the vultures circle. Putting wars on a divine footing meant that there was very little room for individual humans to take credit for one victory or another, and at first people were satisfied with that. Then they weren't. As armies grew more powerful, the leaders of those armies, the Lugals, Lugal being a word meaning big man, became more important and more powerful, and they began taking credit for the victories. Sure, the gods might have helped, they would say, but it was really my strategy, my excellent leadership that won us that battle, that crushed the enemy army, that defeated that city. This is reflected in the artwork. Remember how in the previous picture of victory you have the god Girsu capturing the enemy army as his hunting net, crushing their heads with his mace? Now take a look at this picture. Here is the Lugal, the leader of the army, in his horned helmet. And actually it's quite interesting because horned helmets are often associated with the gods, not with men. And he is standing upon a pile of corpses. The victory is his. Where are the gods? Two tiny stars shining up in the heavens, looking down with approval at his victory. So you have this enormous shift in perspective from wars are wars between gods to wars are wars between men, with the gods looking on. That led to a shift in perspective on who should be ruling. If everything is simply a matter of tussles between the gods, it makes total sense for the priests in the temples to continue ruling everything in the cities. But if humans are the ones who are fighting the battles, if it is on humans' shoulders that victory or defeat rests, it makes sense for humans to be ruling. And so you start to see Lugals using the power of their armies and the credit they're taking for those victories as a way to rule entire cities. They don't chuck the priests in the temples out, they let them keep some power, but they decide that they're the ones who should be in charge of all the laws and the defense. And these Lugals become kings. The word monarchy means rule by kings, and monarchy soon became the standard in Sumerian cities. Over time, priests and kings found a balance of power. Temples remained the center of religious life, which was still very important, while kings are the ones who passed laws, raised armies, and defended the city. You can see this shift from religious rule alone to a balance of religious and secular rule in the Bible as well. Think about it. During the time of Moses and the time of Judges, God would tell the people of Israel what to do through Moses or through the priests or through the judges. But then what happened? The people of Israel wanted a king. They wanted a second secular rule. And in 1 Samuel, Saul becomes just that. He is anointed king. And all of a sudden, Israel goes from following God alone to following God and a king. And that doesn't always work out so well for them. Back in Mesopotamia, however, that balance of religious and secular power worked very well for a man named Sargon of Akkad, also called Sargon the Great, who, intelligent and ambitious as he was, managed to rise from being the abandoned baby of a high priestess to the ruler of the first empire. This is Sargon of Akkad, Sargon the Great. He reigned for 56 years, from 2334 BC to 2279 BC. And in that time, he managed to conquer all of Mesopotamia. On a personal level, Sargon the Great could be merciless, unflinching in his ambition, even when it meant dragging his enemy, formerly his friend, around in a dog collar before killing him. However, on a grander scale, his conquering of Mesopotamia, his founding of the First Empire, actually ended up being a good thing for much of the area. For one thing, he standardized weights and measurements across Mesopotamia. Prior to this, because each city was like its own country, there was different systems to measure how much something weighed or how long something was. And as you can imagine, that got really confusing when you were trying to trade or do business with other places. Sargon of Akkad changed all that. He said, we're going to have one system and it's going to be the same everywhere, so that if you want to buy a pound of flour, it's going to be the same pound of flour in here as it is here. So he standardized weights and measurements across Mesopotamia. He founded the first postal system. His improvements to the way that Mesopotamia traded made it a bustling center of commerce that even traded as far as Greece. So people under the reign of Sargon of Akkad were able to become richer, make money more easily, and also have access to goods they wouldn't otherwise have access. Sargon the Great's invention of empire founded himself a dynasty that lasted for 157 years and a legend that has lasted for thousands more. 1,500 years after Sargon's death, rulers were still naming themselves after him in hopes that by calling themselves Sargon, people would think that they were just as great as Sargon the Great himself. Not only that, but remember how Iraq is the modern country where Mesopotamia once was? Well, the legend of Sargon is still so present in the people's minds there that in the year 1990, fully 4,200 years after Sargon the Great's death, then Iraqi leader Saddam Hussein compared himself to Sargon the Great. In other words, even more than 4,000 years after the death of Sargon of Akkad, he is still so legendary that modern-day rulers would want to compare themselves to him in order to make themselves seem more important, powerful, and legendary in the eyes of their people. Next week, we will be looking at another legend, Hammurabi, and his famous Code of Laws. See you next week.